Welcome everyone to this wireless industry panel discussion, Rising to the Challenge, Connected Communities, moderated by myself, Michelle James, Vice President, Strategic Industry Programs at CTIA. CTIA is the Wireless Industry Trade Association. Today's panel discussion will explore a variety of smart city use case deployments. As wireless industry experts who are joining me here today, we'll also share how IoT and wireless innovations are shaping our communities. These smart city experts will share trends and strategies on how municipalities can benefit from 5G, the importance of community engagement, and the ways that IoT is addressing environmental challenges, bridging connectivity, and improving the lives of all citizens within connected communities today. Joining me today, I'm super proud of our panelists. CTIA members and esteemed panelists include Dr. Brenda Connor from Ericsson, Karen Lightman with Carnegie Mellon University Smart Cities Institute, Metro 21, Talene Agazarian with Modus, and Ariel Brazil from AT&T. At CTIA, we have several working groups who collaborate on best practices. This is just a small representation of some of our discussions that we do inside the association. But we work towards collaborating on best practices, discuss live use case deployments, and solve for industry challenges, basically common industry challenges related to IoT deployments. There are many areas to solve for a smart city. For us, we sort of see a smart city as a geography of IoT. In our work at CTIA, we focus on three core verticals: smart utilities, smart transportation, and smart public services, which also includes smart public safety. For today, we'll highlight a few of those trends that are essential for municipalities. First, when we ask the question sort of, what makes a community smart? Let's start with what's happening at inside communities today. Many communities are turning to IoT and wireless technologies to keep their citizens connected and city operations running as smoothly and efficiently as possible, even during the remote environment that we're all working through today, powering through this global pandemic. But if we look at it, so what really makes a community smart? We'll first start with Brenda, and I'm going to call you a 4G and 5G expert and focus on 4G and 5G ecosystems. What challenges does a connected community need to overcome in order to accelerate their exploration into becoming smart?
Wow, that is a great question, Michelle, because there's so many things where to start. But I'll pick three, and I'll focus in on practicality, partnerships, and procurement. But let me start with a definition of a smart community, because there's so many definitions out there. You got to answer in a context. So the context I like to use is that a smart community uses information and communications technology to provide measurable results to citizens, visitors, and commerce. And I underscore the measurable results. So let's look on the three challenges. Practicality. When you're doing ICT types of smart transformations, you're competing with the use of tax dollars for things like potholes. And often when you're doing smart community things, you're dealing with efficiencies and better use of tax dollars and these sorts of things. And it has to be measurable because, potholes. The second thing I'll point out is challenges around partnerships. To use those tax dollars efficiently, most citizens don't want their tax dollars used for science experiments. So then you have to partner with those that are experts in those smart technologies. But they may not be the normal cast of vendors that are already in the system of that smart community. And so they may not even know they need to sign up with each and every little municipality in order to be able to, for them to take advantage of the capabilities they bring. And that brings me to the third challenge, which is procurement. There are very important procurement processes in place to make sure that things like corruption don't happen. But that also then means that the progress can be not on a timeline that ICT is used to. So, for example, it can take 5-10 years in order to get a good idea through all of the processes to where it's implemented. And by that time, with the pace of technological evolution, it can be kind of dated. So it comes back to lots of challenges, but measurable results, practicality, partnerships, and procurement. These are the three areas that we spend a lot of time in conversation around.
Excellent. And then just as a follow-up to that, so how are the innovations in connectivity different for communities than they are, for example, than the average consumer or typical citizen?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So let's talk about an example. Those innovations in connectivity, let's talk about data. And let's be very pointed and talk about video. For citizens, then you're used to video coming from a server down to your phone, like YouTube. And if you have children, they may be looking at the little kiddie videos. They're quite popular. But then the data is going from the server to the device. When you start to talk about a smart community, though, they're using a municipality, they're using, say, video. Then it's about smart body cameras on your public safety officers, or it's about traffic cameras or video surveillance. Then the data is going from the camera, from the device to a server, opposite direction. And you need a certain latency and bandwidth and security in order to secure that communications. So now you talk about those sorts of needs, opposite direction, very deterministic connectivity capabilities and characteristics. That's where 5G really ticks the box on enabling those communities to be able to do those command and control real-time types of innovations.
Very interesting. And then Karen, we'll turn to you. So at Carnegie Mellon University, I kind of think of it as the birthplace of computer science, right? So, but basically your experience as the executive director for Carnegie Mellon University's Smart Cities Institute Metro Lab 21. Yes, it's a mouthful. How can municipalities use smart city technology as a tool?
Well, thank you. And it's an honor to be here with these amazing women. So thank you for this. So at Metro 21 Smart Cities Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, it's really critical that we use technology as a tool, not a guide, because what we're doing is we're starting with the problem. Sometimes it's a pothole, right? And sometimes it's much more complicated, and sometimes it's much more simple, but we've got to go to where our municipal and community partners have identified a problem. Sometimes we might have expertise at Carnegie Mellon in something like robots can go to Mars, but that may not be as applicable to what's happening in our neighborhoods and in our communities. So we work in that sweet spot of using the expertise in artificial intelligence, in computer science, and the arts as well, because we're really strong in those areas, in engineering. And then we work in identifying the problems with our partners, and then we work in that sweet spot. And I think it's really important. The way that we do it is we have this RD&D model. So it's research and development and deployment. And it's the idea that sometimes you have a great idea that's in the lab and we did it on campus and it was flawless. And then you take it to the real world and there's unintended consequences. So we feel that it's a lot smarter to co-create and collaborate with our community partners, with our municipal partners in a very time-bound, measurable deployment so that we can see what went well and what went wrong. And sometimes things go swimmingly fantastic. Usually there's tweaks. And I think what's really important too, we're talking about the public realm and trust, especially these days, is such a critical issue. And the tech backlash is very real. And so if you're talking about using things like recognition, cameras, like you were talking about, Brenda, and using facial recognition in video, there's been a lot of tech backlash. San Francisco, I think, was the first city to say absolutely not. And they basically banned everything. And what worries me is that it then becomes the baby out with the bathwater, because if you can use things like edge computing, right, where you can do the processing at the edge, then you can make sure that the data that's being sent is secure. It is confidential. And so there is no risk of a hack. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I do want to make sure is that we are aware of bias, and that sometimes can be built in. And so we can only learn those things by deploying. We're not going to be back to, we're not going to be Luddites, right? The Pandora's box has been opened, and technology is here, and facial recognition technology is here, but let's do it in a thoughtful, equitable and secure way that benefits everybody. And so that's why my motto and our motto, Metro 21, is really, yes, there's lots of great technology and we can do a lot, but use it as a tool, like one of the tools in your tool belt when you're collaborating with your partners.
So let's stick with real world challenges. I know you mentioned a couple of those throughout your description there, but we talk about digital equity. One thing is, I love that the conversation is now changing. Instead of digital divide, it's really more a conversation around digital equity, which I feel like it's a much easier thing for people to get their heads around. It's talking about what we want to have, not what we don't have, right? So, but how can communities find success with smart cities technologies relative to digital equity, and how do they go about addressing starting the goal for how they help close the gap?
Well, it's first, like you said, language means a lot. And so, this issue of equity is so important because it's not just access. Like if something is accessible but unaffordable, it's not equitable. So and one of the things here in my hometown of Pittsburgh, I have a daughter in the public school system. And when we went remote for COVID, 40% of the kids didn't have access to reliable broadband and internet. So instead of, and they couldn't, fix that real quick. So it meant that they were literally mailing out and handing out packets to high schoolers and, kids for the remaining months because of that digital inequity, that it wasn't fair. So I think that's what has laid bare is the inequity and we're seeing this in rural communities as well as urban communities alike. Access does not mean it's equitable. And so one of the projects we've done here at Carnegie Mellon in collaboration with the University of Pittsburgh and others is to create something called a meta mesh network. So it's the idea of using cellular technology and advanced technology to create these mesh networks to kind of almost jimmy rig a system whereby you can enable Wi-Fi access and broadband access for low-income communities that normally couldn't get access because of the price factor. So we're doing 3 pilot projects in the region. And so the school systems were able to open, everybody's remote. My daughter maybe is not happy about that being fully online from 7:30 until 3, but now it can be equitable. And they made sure that the kids also had, it's a hardware thing too, right?
Yeah, that's
so
right.
I think that's the issue, is that it's the way that we look at broadband, typically we don't consider it a public utility. But what we've seen now is, in order to be a part of this digital world, people need access, and broadband access is critical and fiber access is critical to enable that, so that when we have deployments like 5G and the like, that it can be done to benefit everyone and equitably. And so I know that there's, and my hope is that with this new Biden administration that'll be coming in January, and that there will be more investments in the digital infrastructure, because I don't think the private sector can do this alone, right? I think there needs to be a role of the public sector to help fill the gaps so that this digital inequity can be addressed.
Great. And then, so Ariel, let's, from an AT&T perspective, in terms of distance learning and telework, let's sort of stay on that subject for a minute. How are you guys helping to keep communities connected? And what can municipalities do to leverage those connectivity solutions to help strengthen the remote experiences?
Yeah, we've seen a tremendous growth in the amount of traffic that's going across our network every day. It's up nearly 20% from pre-pandemic times, up to about over 390 petabytes of data a day. I mean, so just tremendous volumes. And we're going to continue to see that to grow, whether it's in this current environment or in the future. As Brenda alluded to, I mean, video traffic for consumers alone is increasing. That's just the way that people are ingesting their content. So back to Karen's point too, it's critical that we address access for folks, both in terms of access to the network, access to devices, as well as access to digital literacy, understanding how to use the network responsibly and safely and securely. We're seeing cities and municipalities, states across the country look at tackling these kinds of challenges in a lot of different ways. And it's really going to depend on the need of that particular community or communities, within communities. We've seen some that are looking at having public Wi-Fi in more of their common areas in places like parks or in community centers and parking lots while we're still in this COVID environment and people aren't going into facilities as much, to things like deploying buses with mobile hotspots, but also just some simpler solutions like cities and states investing in mobile hotspots that can be checked out from the libraries or schools or community centers to help bridge that immediate gap while the long-term investments in the network are being made. And some of it too just goes back to, I was just going to also add that a lot of times there are already programs in place to provide access to broadband services at reduced costs that folks may be eligible for and they're just not aware of. So it goes back to working in close partnership with those municipalities to make sure everyone is aware of the resources that are available to them.
Excellent. Yeah, and so in terms of looking at long-term investments, so one of the hot topics, another hot topic, I should say, 5G, the deployment of 5G and sort of what that looks like. Communities are exploring options to help deliver real-time data when it's needed most to make the most informed decisions, whether it's monitoring and changing traffic patterns, which obviously even with remote work, some of those have changed and probably will likely change permanently going forward. So what does that look like for the future? Deployment of emergency vehicles, as well as what are cities doing to help innovate relative to autonomous infrastructure and all sorts of solutions around autonomous infrastructure. Jolene, can you share a little bit some of the challenges that you've seen sort of working with municipalities for 5G and small cell build out?
Sure, thank you. I think when small cell technology first came out, I think cities just had a really hard time understanding what that really was and how it could impact them. The technologies, these are lower powered facilities. They have a smaller footprint and they are primarily attached onto utility and city light standards in the public right of way. So really a new concept versus sort of the traditional wireless facilities we've seen throughout the years. And so being low powered, more of them are necessary in order to bridge the gap in the service needs. And so cities needing to look at their processes internally to adapt to the sheer volumes of applications that were coming to them by different carriers. Being new, having to update their ordinances to include small cell criteria and requirements, adopting design guidelines to better streamline the look of these facilities to, again, provide efficiency to get these applications through. And our company Modus has been doing this for quite some time now, where we've seen sort of both spectrums where, dealing with hundreds of cities across the country, we've come across cities that have really taken the time to adapt and really change their internal processes to kind of get a rhythm and flow going, because we're seeing hundreds of these applications going at a time, because there is such a need to close the gap in service needs. And then also kind of seeing the other side of it, where some cities are still working to that point where they can get to a situation where these applications are easily getting through. But I think what is common is, as applicants, we need to see these municipalities as partners, and we need to collaborate with them every day, and through working through sort of the issues that we see on a daily basis to kind of get to a point where we're getting through these deployments successfully.
And how do these small cell build outs, how do they impact residential neighborhoods?
You know, they do, because we're seeing more of these go into residential neighborhoods simply because there is identified areas of need where there is such a gap in service. And I think that in order to do that, though, they have to be placed properly. And so communities are more aware, and they definitely have concerns and questions. And so community outreach is a very key component to what we do. It is our job to educate and provide as much information as needed in order to have these communities understand the necessity of these facilities. I come from a land use background, so it's really important that where we site these facilities is in the least intrusive locations. And at Modus, we have a very extensive team that looks at that very carefully. We work with engineers to ensure that we're not only sort of bridging that gap and making sure we're satisfying the needs of the network, but also being sensitive to the surrounding areas to make sure that these are well integrated into these communities. When we think about design, we have to make sure that there's the least amount of visual impact. So we've come up with very creative solutions to help screen some of the equipment, some of the cabling, so that it's very well integrated into the poles and the communities. And I know we've all mentioned how critical connectivity is these days. So much of us are working remote. Our kids are doing school online. So it's now more than ever such a need to make sure that we have a robust network that is sustainable now and into the future.
So when we look at the evolution between 4G to 5G, Brenda, I was lucky enough to hear an explanation that you gave recently that was crystal clear for a non-engineer type like myself. That basically talked about, you know, what you can do in 5th generation cellular that you can't do in 4th generation. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So with every generation of cellular that we deploy, there is both an evolution and a revolution. An evolution and a revolution. If I look at 4th generation, which we sometimes call LTE, 4th generation, the evolution was you get more bandwidth, lower latency, right? And it made data be good enough, but good enough for what? The revolution was the emergence of all those smartphone apps and the innovative business models that they unleashed, such as rideshare apps, sharing apps, which have had another loop with COVID, by the way, but they were very, you know, they emerged. And what was the revolution? That they emerged and that they impacted some existing industry, private car service, taxi car service, right? So there was a revolution in business model that was human-centric. With 5th generation, now that evolution and revolution. Evolution, more bandwidth, lower latency. We already talked about that. But the revolution is that now it's all about the data and what the data unleashes. It's not human-centric. That was 4th generation. It's data-centric. It's machine to machine, IoT. The sorts of innovative business models that are now being unleashed because 5G can provide a deterministic and reliable latency, bandwidth, and security to enable command and control. And you talk about, you mentioned autonomous vehicle, you mentioned all these sorts of use cases that depend on that data getting where it needs to be, when it needs to be, how it needs to be, and that you can be, it's, you know, it's not been mucked with, right? So that kind of revolution is going to enable new business models that you don't predict. You don't predict, just like who predicted that these sharing apps were going to become so pervasive, right? As an example, in the other smartphone related apps. So yeah, evolution, revolution. So 5G, it's all about the data and what you can do with it to provide measurable outcomes. And that's where the money's going to be made.
And then Ariel, what role do you see 5G playing in smart cities?
Well, I really think Brenda touched on a lot of it. I mean, there are advances in smart cities that we've kind of known for a while that we would need 5G to actually achieve, like having a truly autonomous infrastructure. You know, you hear so many times about the example of a connected intersection where the ambulance gets to go through and the lights change and pedestrians know not to go. So that's kind of the classic use case. And we also know that with 5G, we're going to be able to connect, you know, millions of devices in a concentrated area in a square mile versus, you know, thousands that we might have today. So we're going to get to this point where we are having a lot more data coming in, ingesting that we can use to drive measurable outcomes. But we're really excited about the things that we don't know are going to happen yet. We know that video is going to play a big role in smart cities, just as it is with how people are doing schooling and telework and everything today. There have been studies that say, you know, in just a few years, that the traffic that's on the network could be about 80% of the data that's going across networks. And that's going to be a huge increase from what we see today. And it's going to be 5G that allows that to happen.
That's super exciting. I used to tell stories all the time, you know, having worked with Nokia, what feels like 100 years ago now, considering all the evolution that the wireless networks have had since. But we had GPS and all sorts of technology and the device way before the use case presented itself. And I think that, you know, ultimately inside of smart cities, like we have some known use cases that we are pretty sure are going to be impacted with 5G. And then I think we'll have some surprises that will come along the way too, once the innovators sort of get their hands on the infrastructure once it's built out. So while we're talking about use cases and sort of deployment successes, I guess, can we talk a little bit about I think you touched on it earlier, like the community engagement, Ariel, in terms of 5G. How does that look? What does it look like to engage the community when you are rolling out a new technology like 5G?
Yeah, well, it definitely goes back to what challenges are folks looking to solve, and 5G is going to help address some of the biggest challenges that our society faces. And one of those is around environmental concerns. We see there being just huge amounts of data that are being used for things like delivering critical services, water, lighting, that there just frankly isn't a need for anymore. We have the tools and the ability to decrease that water usage, to decrease that energy consumption by using things like smart water metering, smart lighting, to have the real-time control over the use of those things. But there are also some really cool use cases that you might not have thought of, outside of just smart water meters. There are other ways to impact our footprint on the environment. We actually did a really cool case study where by using real-time video footage from drones and sending that data back to inspectors, that there's the potential to vastly decrease the energy use in terms of water tank inspection, the water loss itself. And then, of course, there's monetary savings that go along with that. So, like I said, it all goes back to what challenges are we going to use technology to address. But I think there's some really exciting low-hanging fruit that we can go after right now.
Great, that's exciting. And so I love where we're using wireless technologies, or technologies in general, but technologies to build, efficiencies around current infrastructure. But if I had sort of a crystal ball, Karen, Carnegie Mellon, if you're looking at, sort of advanced, sort of what are you seeing relative to, artificial intelligence and robotics, and, so we have kind of, let's secure what we have, add additional efficiencies to what infrastructure is in place today. But then if we were to look to the future, what does that look like from your view?
Well, I want the future to be equitable as well. And I want it to be trustworthy. And so a lot of my colleagues and I are part of a team that we put together. The name is ATLAS because we love acronyms in academia. It's Autonomous Technologies for Livability and Sustainability. So it's taking into account some of the stuff that Ariel was talking about with sustainability and environment, but also in an equitable, trustworthy way. So it's not just autonomous vehicles and autonomous buildings, but it's connected and autonomous. So it's going to need all of that technology, but how can we do that in a way that is trustworthy? And so, we look at what Sidewalk Labs tried to do in Toronto, and it was this, oh, we're Google, just trust us, give us all your data, don't worry. And I think the Canadians, especially in Toronto, they were like, no way. and so there was a tech backlash and a community backlash because they weren't just gonna, give over all their data. So we're proposing to have a community, almost like a stakeholder community, where I get to retain my agency. I get to make decisions, but I'm also informed by what's happening in my community. And that's done in a way to improve efficiency, to improve equity, and build trust. And so we're looking at how do you pull in not just robotics and artificial intelligence and machine learning and really awesome, mechanical and civil engineering expertise, but also how do we think about the ethics? How do we think about human nature? Because humans are not always rational. So how do we build that society in a way that is equitable? And so that's what we're looking at Carnegie Mellon. And it's something that we call at the intersection of technology and humanity, or I like to say it's humanity and technology, because if we are going to have this future state with 5G and low latency and high speed and all that, that's great. But if we can't trust it, if the people who are living in that community don't feel like it's for them, there's going to be a backlash. And if it's only for a few, rich, elite, or lucky, then that's not equitable either. So I think that is what I'm so proud of the work that we're doing at Carnegie Mellon, is we're looking at the future in terms of the AI and the connectivity and the edge computing and all that, drones and robots and all that. I love that, connected autonomous vehicles and buildings, but it's also doing it in a way that's thinking about the humans and human beings' irrational behavior at times, and how to think of it in an ethical, sustainable, and equitable way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So as we get ready to wrap up, Jillian, can you just speak briefly to some of the key deployments that you're seeing from your view?
Right. I think this is all very exciting what we're talking about, and just where I've seen our success has been helping 5G deployment happen and being successful in that, because I feel that's just kind of like the infrastructure that's going to really get all this future technology going. And for us, it's dealing with all these different municipalities in all very different stages of their comfort level in processing all these different types of technologies and applications. And so we're seeing sort of the larger cities really take off, and we've been able to get so much through, and so many 5G facilities launched and on air. But where I see sort of another real success is when we go into cities for the first time, sort of the smaller communities that have never seen what a small cell is. They've never taken in one of these applications. So just the knowledge that we've accumulated over the years, we feel like we're kind of helping them along and paving the way to get them to understand what this is and that it is a positive for their communities. One city in mind, it took us probably 3 years to get to a point where we had an approved solution to deploy a small cell facility. And that took extensive community outreach, countless public hearings, constant internal staff meetings just to get to this point. But when we finally got there, it was a success, and it was just such a great feeling to be able to build these facilities and get them launched, and to be the first company to do that. You know, our client was very happy. We were very happy. It's just those hard wins that feel really good, because as we've all mentioned, just connectivity is so critical, and it needs to be for all communities. And so if we can impart and help those communities, even the small ones, it's just a great feeling to be a part of that.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And for us at CTIA, what, sort of gets me up in the day is just being able to have an opportunity to have knowledge transfer even among the industry and then among stakeholders within the cities. There isn't a one size fits all for everyone. So the more we actually continue to stay in conversation with each other, the better it is for everyone, including, engaging the communities directly. So, with that, I'm super excited with all the work that everyone is doing to make 5G possible, to embrace smart cities solutions and conversation. I'm very proud of our long-term thought leadership with our working groups at CTIA and our commitment to providing resources to all. And really super big shout out to Qualcomm for allowing us to share more with you today. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Sanjeet.